Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's podcast. Before we get started, I just want to name that a personal fact about me right now is that I'm currently deep in Iron Flame, which is book 2 of Rebecca Yaros's Empyrean series, which is about, it's like a romantasy novel about a dragon rider school. This is not my typical fare, but I am really into it, I gotta say. So I'm curious about whether any of you are getting swept along by this romantasy trend. I really did not think that was my jam, but man, I started with the Court of Thorns and Roses series, which is so addictive, and it really gets me. So I feel like it would be so easy for me as someone who works from home to just spend every minute that I'm not with clients like reading those books. But I'm trying to just save it for after dinner and before bed, and also whenever I want on the weekends. So that's just a personal share for me right now in this moment of my life. So with that in mind, let's get to today's podcast topic. Okay, so today I wanted to share something that I noticed myself saying to 2 or 3 different clients recently. And it's this: it might not be a logical decision, at least not in the way that you think. I'm going to say it again. It might not be a logical decision, at least not in the way that you think. So in today's podcast, I want to expand on that little tidbit a bit. I want to talk about 3 main weaknesses I have noticed that our logical brains can have in some kinds of decision making. That's what I mean when I say that logical decision making might not be the way you decide in all situations. Then I want to talk about what we can consult instead. And then finally, I want to flesh out that second little bit that I said when I said at least not in the way that you think, because I think there's a funny way in which non-logical decisions can actually turn out to be more logical than we initially expect. So if you were already tempted to not even listen to this podcast because you are on, team logic, please do stick around. I think you might be surprised where we end up. Along the way, as I often do, I'm going to share some real client examples. And given that I have shared this idea with so many of my clients recently, I have a hunch that probably some of you out there too need to hear it. So let's do it. Okay, so as I said, first, I want to kick this off by sharing some ways in which it can sometimes not work when we try to make important decisions with our kind of logical brain. The first, and I think really the most important reason is this: our logical brains often do not appropriately weight our reasons. I'm going to say that again. Our logical brains often do not appropriately weight our reasons. Okay, so I want to say more about this. On some level, any decision is simply gathering all of the reasons that matter to you, reasons for or reasons against a decision, and then assigning them relative weight, which just means like relative importance. So even if you made a pro-con list, and even if there were 14 reasons not to do something and only 1 reason to do something, if the reason to do something was a very, very important reason, if you put a lot of weight on it, then the right choice might be to do it. The weight that we assign to our relative reasons is ultimately everything, right? And to give some more specific examples to really flesh that out, maybe, one reason not to leave your job is that you are a regular at a salad place near your building. And it's really nice that when you walk in, they know your order and they know your name. You get to decide how much weight you assign to that reason, how much it matters to you. On the flip side, maybe there's another reason, to not leave your job, which is that you have to, say, financially support your parents, and you couldn't support them if you left your job. Again, you get to decide how much weight you place on that. Some people might assign a lot of weight to being a regular at a salad place. Maybe that's something that they really love. It takes a long time to build. It matters. The salad people give me a free drink sometimes, and others wouldn't. Ditto on terms of sort of financially supporting one's parents. And this is where it's actually really important to point out our logical brain is inherently emotional. Because our logical brain might be saying, I'm being logical. I'm just doing a pro-con list. But the weights that we assign to things, they're not inherent facts about the universe, even though our brains sometimes tell us that they are. The weights that we assign to things are more about our values and our desires. That's not logical. It's not solving a mathematical theorem where the hypotenuse squared is always equal to the, a squared plus b squared. It's actually inherently emotional. It will and must vary from person to person and from life season to life season. It's personal. It's priorities. So let that marinate in your brain a little bit. This idea that weights are probably inherently a little bit emotional. And let me give some real client examples here of how I find the logical brain can mess us up when it comes to weighting things. I can think of at least 4 clients I have had in the last 18 months who have come to me wanting to leave their jobs. And they all said to me, truly all of them, well, logically, I really should find my next job before leaving this one. Each of them said that to me. So here we are with the logic brain right off the bat. And of course, finding your next job before leaving this one, that can be a very logical choice, right? It can mean that there's no gap in your resume. There's no gap in income. It's not illogical to place a significant weight on those things. But as I discussed it more with each of those clients separately, it was pretty clear that they, on some deeper level, didn't want to stay at their jobs until they found the next thing. Several of them were very burnt out. They wanted some time to rest. Several of them felt like looking for a new job while trying to perform at the level that they wanted to perform at their current job. It would be exhausting and honestly, maybe even impossible for them. Several more were very low motivation. They had just been working for a really long time, sometimes for a decade or more, without, more than a week or two of vacation at a time, which often happens when we have corporate jobs. And so as they thought about new jobs, nothing sounded that interesting. And it was clear to both of us, and I talk about this more in a lot of work that I do about compasses, but that they just needed to kind of rejuice for a moment in order to find that motivation again. And to be clear, I'm not here saying like, oh, fairies and rainbows, just, decide you want to quit your job and everything will work out. But I am here to say that as I talk with each of those clients, and I can still envision the particulars of each of their stories in my mind, each of them had reasons that were also on some level very logical, very reasonable for wanting to leave their jobs without something lined up. And to me, this was a classic case for each of them of their logical brains not appropriately weighting certain qualities. Their brains were saying, it's the no gap in revenue or income that matters. Just get it done, whatever. You're not tired, you're not motivated, it doesn't matter. Do it anyway. So on one hand, if we were all robots and motivation and desire and energy, they didn't matter, then yeah, this would have been perhaps even arguably the only logical decision. But my clients weren't robots, and motivation and desire and wanting and energy did play a role. And for these clients, a very significant role. And their logical brains were just not even allowing them to acknowledge that and to weight it properly. And I will say, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're applying these ideas to yourself, I find that these qualities, again, motivation and desire and wanting and energy, these are some of the most commonly underweighted things by our logical brains. And for my clients, because their logical brains were not allowing them to weight the importance of these reasons highly enough, they were having fairly serious negative consequences in their lives. Several of them, from a work perspective, have been passed over for promotions. Again, that actually makes a lot of sense because when your motivation and your energy are low, even if you think you're performing at your best, you aren't. Others, if they had actually shifted careers like they wanted to earlier, instead of sort of sticking around their jobs because they kept telling themselves they couldn't leave their jobs until they had a new one lined up, but then they weren't actually getting a new job. If they'd actually just made the shift like they actually wanted to, and if they'd actually been motivated in these new jobs, they would have progressed quite a lot in their new careers or jobs by now. So by not moving sooner, they had lost out. They had missed on important chances to grow in their new jobs. And even beyond that, beyond work, virtually all of them felt that disliking their jobs, being exhausted, was seriously impacting their personal lives. They were less kind or patient with their partners or kids. They were stressed out a lot. They were just not enjoying their lives. So I say all this to illustrate this issue that I think the logical brain can have limitations. It doesn't always weight things properly. In the case of these clients, it wasn't allowing them to weight the importance of energy or motivation or things like that. So that's the biggest issue I would identify with, consulting that quote unquote logical brain. And then there's two more reasons, which I'm just going to quickly mention. The first one is that our logical brains can completely miss certain reasons. This is related, but it is slightly different. Our logical brains might not even kind of like slightly notice it, but not give it enough weight. It might not even notice certain factors that might actually be the deciding factors. So several of those clients I mentioned actually had no idea when we first started talking that motivation or energy might play a role into their decision about, exactly when to leave their current job. Should they leave it after they've gotten their new job or should they leave it before? And if I find for many people, if you find that you're really dragging your feet on making a decision, it's often that you're missing a reason that matters that you should be taking into account. So the second issue with the logical brain, it can just miss certain things entirely. And the third reason is that I find that our logical brains are less likely to be consistent about how they weight things. I'm going to say that one again. Our logical brains are less likely to be consistent about how they weight things. In my experience as a human myself and just watching my clients, I find that our logical brains often seem to kind of like jump around more. I have clients come to me saying like, oh, I should do this and I shouldn't do this. And it seems like the logical brain is weighting different factors differently on different days. Of course, part of this is just a human condition. Some decisions are just genuinely very hard to make. I've talked about that many times before. But I find that a decent percentage of what's going on is often that these clients are trying to make the decision through logic. And because the logical brain is not hooked up to something deeper within us, it can kind of hop around. So that brings us to the next section of this podcast. If we can't kind of quote unquote know the relative importance of our reasons logically, if the logical brain has all of these issues, particularly around appropriately weighting issues and sometimes even acknowledging what reasons matter to us, how do we make decisions? What's the alternative? So I do want to talk about that. And this is a moment where the fact that I'm really primarily a one-on-one coach really comes to the fore, because I would speak about this differently depending on the client in front of me. For some clients, I would say, it might not be a logical decision. It might be more of a spiritual decision. Because for some people, the word spiritual really resonates. Spiritual doesn't have to be an organized religion of any kind, like Christian or Jewish or Hindu or something. It can, though for some of my clients, that does really resonate. For other clients, spiritual can mean sort of a more intrinsic felt experience, maybe something deep within you or something much larger than you. A sort of, again, like a more intrinsic spiritual question to me would be something like, what is life asking of you right now? What decision would life like you to make? Ooh, I love that one even as I say it. Okay. For other clients, I would use words like intuition or knowing or rightness. And just in case, if you're a very logical person like I especially used to be, and you kind of shut down when I even say the word intuition, I want to name that intuition is not about, fairy dust. It's not about ancestors speaking to you, unless you are into those things, in which case, go at it. But for me, personally, my favorite description of how intuition works on a brain level is by a book called The Power of Agency, which is by a guy named Paul Napper and a guy named Anthony Rao. In that book, they have this great quote, or the whole discussion about intuition, but they have one quote that I love in particular where they say, intuition makes rapid, beneath the surface mental connections. Intuition is when your mind weaves perceptions together from the millions of stored bits of your memories and experiences. It's capable of creating a new holistic understanding of a situation. Oh, so good. Almost always well before you arrive at a decision through conscious, logical thought. I love this. Napper and Rao here, I think, are pointing out that intuition, it always involves the brain. It's just using different parts of the brain, often sort of deeper ones that are not yet in your conscious awareness. I mean, all of us, even those of us who aren't neuroscientists, we know that the prefrontal cortex, which is kind of the seat of our conscious awareness, our logical reasoning, it's really just a small percentage of our overall brain matter. So when we're using things like the intuition or sort of just like a deeper connection to rightness, I feel like we're often using kind of deeper parts of our brain. We call them more primal parts of our brain, where certainly emotions live. And I find that those parts of our brain often have a better sense on a subtle level of how to weight things, a more consistent sense of how to weight things, and they often know my true relative priorities. So that is a very short answer to what I suggested said when I say, it might not be a logical decision, at least not in the way that you think. And before we close out, I want to revisit that last part. The part where I say, at least not in the way that you think. Because, and you've probably sensed this even in the conversation so far, but I think that intuition has a logic to it. It's just including certain pieces of information that your conscious awareness, your prefrontal cortex, might not yet be aware of. Many of my clients, and me too, will often realize in retrospect that many of the decisions that we made in a theoretically, non-logical brain way were actually extremely logical. Like maybe when we began, our logical brains were so fixated on weighting certain reasons in very specific ways. Like maybe we were weighting very highly this idea of I must avoid having any gap in income or any gap on our resume. But in retrospect, we might see, what? Yes, that reason matter or those reasons matter, but actually also rest is so important. And I made sense that I assigned a lot of weight to it in my decision making. My clients will say to me in retrospect, actually it turned out that the fastest way to making even more money overall in my next role, and of course being happier and more present with my loved ones, was to take a second to breathe, was to take a little bit time off. So again, it may turn out that, for example, taking some time off between jobs wasn't irrational. It might have turned out to be highly rational and highly logical. But at the time, it may feel like we have to kind of quiet that logical brain to access other kinds of knowing. So that's ultimately why I say to my clients sometimes, it might not be a logical decision, at least not in the way that you think, because I want to open up their brains to other parts of knowing, which of course, in the end, might turn out to be extremely logical. So I hope this is helpful. I hope you can carry it through into your week. As always, I'm rooting for you in the week ahead. You got this. If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.